There is a particular kind of confusion that only exists when someone is using you while still making you feel like you matter to them. If they were cruel, obvious, openly dismissive, you would leave quickly, without much internal debate. The situations that trap people longest are never the obvious ones. They are the ones wrapped in just enough warmth to make the exploitation feel like a misunderstanding rather than a pattern, just enough affection to make you doubt your own perception every time something felt off. I spent a long time inside exactly that kind of confusion before I understood what was actually happening to me. The first sign, and the one I ignored longest, was noticing that my presence in someone's life seemed to expand and contract based entirely on what they needed at the time. When they were struggling, when they needed a favor, when they wanted someone to listen, I was suddenly essential, contacted quickly, treated with what felt like real warmth. When they didn't need anything, the warmth disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a kind of low-grade distance that I kept explaining away as busyness, as personality, as anything other than what it actually was. I told myself this was simply how some people operate, inconsistent by nature rather than calculating by intention. It took me a long time to understand that the timing of someone's attention often reveals more truth than the content of their words. I think this is the clearest, most reliable sign that someone is using you, not a single dramatic moment, but a pattern where their presence correlates almost perfectly with their need. Genuine relationships don't work that way. People who actually value you show up during ordinary moments too, not just the moments where you're useful to them. If someone only appears when they want something and disappears the rest of the time, the relationship was never really about you. You were simply a resource, available on request, valued for your function rather than your presence. I remember rationalizing this pattern for far too long, telling myself that everyone gets busy, that timing doesn't always reflect priorities, that I was being paranoid by reading too much into gaps in communication. Some of that rationalization was fair. People do get busy. Life does interrupt good intentions sometimes. But there's a difference between occasional inconsistency, born from circumstance, and a reliable pattern where attention arrives exactly when something is needed and vanishes exactly when it isn't. Once I started tracking that pattern honestly instead of explaining it away individually each time, the shape of what was actually happening became impossible to ignore. The second sign I had to learn to recognize was subtler, and in some ways, more painful to accept, because it required admitting that my own tendencies had made me an easier target. I noticed that the people who used me most consistently were the ones who understood, whether consciously or not, that I struggled to say no. They didn't need to manipulate me elaborately. They simply needed to ask, because they knew, from experience, that I would rarely refuse, regardless of how inconvenient the request actually was for me. That knowledge, once someone has it about you, becomes something they can quietly rely on indefinitely, without ever needing to acknowledge that they're relying on it. Recognizing this pattern required an uncomfortable kind of self-honesty. It's easier to be angry at someone for using you than to examine why you kept allowing it. But the truth is that being used rarely happens in a vacuum. It usually requires two components: someone willing to take without reciprocating, and someone unwilling to enforce a boundary that would make that taking impossible. I had to accept my role in that dynamic, not to excuse the other person's behavior, but to understand how my own instinct to be endlessly accommodating had quietly signaled that I was safe to exploit. Once I understood this about myself, I started noticing a related sign that had been present the entire time without me fully registering it. People who use you rarely ask for permission to keep taking. They simply continue taking until you say something, and even then they often act surprised, sometimes hurt, that you would suddenly object to a pattern they had grown comfortable relying on. That reaction, confusion, or defensiveness the moment you finally set a boundary is itself a revealing sign. Someone who genuinely valued you as a person, rather than as a resource, would want to know if something they were doing felt burdensome. Someone using you experiences your boundary not as new information, but as an inconvenience to their access. I learned to pay close attention to how people responded the first time I said no to something I would normally have automatically agreed to. The reactions told me almost everything I needed to know. Some people responded with mild surprise, followed by easy acceptance, evidence that they valued my actual well-being over their own convenience. Others responded with guilt, subtle accusations, reminders of everything I supposedly owed them, an entire performance designed to make saying no feel like a betrayal rather than a reasonable request. That second reaction, more than almost anything else, revealed the difference between a relationship built on mutual care and one built on quiet extraction. The third sign, and one of the hardest to accept, was recognizing how one-sided the emotional labor had become in certain relationships. I noticed that I was consistently the one initiating conversations, checking in during difficult moments, remembering important details, offering support during hard times. When my own difficult moments arrived, Saint reciprocity rarely appeared. People who had received consistent emotional support from me often responded to my own struggles with distraction, minimal engagement, or a quick pivot back to their own concerns. That imbalance, over time, is one of the clearest indicators that a relationship has become extractive rather than mutual. I used to excuse this imbalance by telling myself that some people simply weren't as emotionally expressive, that their lack of reciprocation didn't necessarily mean indifference, just a different way of processing things. Sometimes that's true, but when the pattern repeats consistently, across multiple situations, across enough time to rule out coincidence, it stops being a difference in emotional style and becomes a reliable indicator of where someone's actual priorities lie. People make time and energy for what they consider important. If your struggles consistently receive less attention than theirs, that discrepancy is information, not an accident. Another sign I had to learn to recognize involved how people spoke about me when they thought I wasn't listening, or more precisely, how they spoke about the function I served rather than who I actually was. I remember overhearing, more than once, conversations where I was described primarily in terms of what I provided, always available, easy to convince, generous with money or time or effort, useful in a pinch. Those descriptions weren't necessarily unkind on the surface, but they revealed something important about how I was actually being perceived. I wasn't being valued as a whole person with my own needs and complexities. I was being valued as a convenient resource, cataloged mentally according to what I could offer rather than who I actually was. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. People who genuinely care about you tend to describe you in terms of your character, your personality, the specific things that make you who you are. People who are primarily using you tend to describe you in terms of your utility, what you do for them, how convenient your presence happens to be. Once I started listening more carefully to how people talked about me, both directly and in the moments they assumed I couldn't hear, the difference between genuine regard and functional appreciation became much easier to detect. I also had to learn to recognize a specific kind of flattery that, in retrospect, almost always preceded a request. There is a version of flattery that exists simply because someone genuinely admires something about you, offered without any attached agenda, arriving independently of anything they might need from you. There is another version that functions almost like a setup, warm enough to lower your guard, specific enough to feel sincere, timed carefully just before a favor is requested. I learned to notice the pattern where compliments clustered suspiciously close to requests, an increase in warmth that seemed to correlate a little too precisely with an upcoming need. This isn't to say every compliment followed by a request is manipulative. Sometimes people genuinely appreciate you and also happen to need something around the same time, and those two things exist independently of each other. But when the pattern repeats consistently enough, when warmth reliably precedes requests and cools reliably once the request has been fulfilled, that rhythm reveals something about the actual function the relationship is serving. Genuine affection doesn't need to be timed strategically. It simply exists consistently, whether or not anything is currently being asked of you. I noticed something else too, something that took me even longer to name clearly. People who use you often resist your growth in subtle ways, particularly growth that would make you less available to them. I remember mentioning ambitions, boundaries, changes I wanted to make in my own life, and noticing a peculiar kind of discouragement from certain people, framed as concern, as practicality, as looking out for my best interests, but functioning in practice as a quiet effort to keep me exactly as available and accommodating as I had always been. Growth threatens extraction. A version of you that sets boundaries, that prioritizes your own needs, that becomes less endlessly available, is far less useful to someone who has built a comfortable pattern around your accommodation. I learned to pay attention to how people responded when I expressed genuine excitement about changes I wanted to make, new priorities, new boundaries, new versions of myself I was hoping to grow into. People who actually cared about my well-being responded with support, even when that growth meant I'd have less time or energy to offer them. People who were primarily using me responded with subtle resistance, questions designed to introduce doubt, reminders of everything that could go wrong, an entire quiet campaign to keep me exactly where I had always been, useful and unchanged. Perhaps the most difficult sign to accept was recognizing how differently I was treated compared to people who had less to offer than I did. I noticed, uncomfortably, that certain people reserved a particular warmth and patience for me specifically because of what I provided, while treating others in their lives, people who couldn't offer the same resources or accommodation, with far less consideration. That discrepancy revealed something important. If someone's kindness toward you is proportional to your usefulness rather than consistent across everyone in their life, that kindness was never really about you as a person. It was a strategic investment in continued access. Recognizing all of this required me to confront an uncomfortable question about my own worth. For a long time, I had unconsciously equated being useful with being valued, assuming that if people needed me, relied on me, benefited from my presence, that reliance was itself a form of love. It took me a long time to understand that need and value are not the same thing, and that being needed for what you provide is a fundamentally different experience from being valued for who you actually are. You can be endlessly needed by someone who would replace you in a week if you stop providing whatever function you currently serve. That realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. Once I understood the difference between being valued and being useful, I started evaluating relationships based on a different question entirely. Not, do they need me, but would they still want me around if I had nothing left to offer them? That question, applied honestly across every relationship in my life, revealed things I had spent years avoiding. Some relationships passed that test easily, built on something sturdier than utility. Others failed it completely, revealing themselves, once I looked closely enough, to have been built almost entirely around what I could provide rather than who I actually was. I also learned to notice how people responded during periods when I genuinely had nothing to give, financially depleted, emotionally exhausted, unable to offer the accommodation I usually provided without complaint. Those periods became unexpectedly revealing. People who valued me consistently stayed present, sometimes even increasing their support during my depletion. People who had primarily been using me grew distant, almost immediately, their attention redirecting toward whoever could currently offer what I temporarily couldn't. That contraction, precisely timed to my depletion, told me everything I needed to know about what those relationships had actually been built around. Once I started recognizing these signs clearly, I had to make an uncomfortable decision about what to do with that recognition. Understanding that someone is using you doesn't automatically make walking away easy, especially when the relationship contains genuine history, genuine shared moments, genuine affection mixed in among the exploitation. Most exploitative dynamics aren't purely exploitative. They contain enough real connection to make the extraction confusing, enough good moments to make you doubt whether you're being too harsh in labeling the pattern accurately. I had to learn that mixed feelings don't disqualify an accurate observation. You can genuinely care about someone, remember real good moments with them, and still recognize that the overall pattern of the relationship has become extractive rather than mutual. Those two things can exist simultaneously. Acknowledging that you're being used doesn't require believing the person is entirely bad or that every moment you shared was fake. It simply requires being honest about the pattern as it currently exists, regardless of whatever good history exists alongside it. Learning to set boundaries with people who had grown comfortable using me required tolerating a period of real discomfort, both from their reactions and from my own guilt about disappointing expectations I had unconsciously helped create. The first several times I said no to a request I would normally have granted automatically, I felt an almost physical unease, a sense that I was doing something wrong, even though logically I understood I was simply protecting my own limited resources. That discomfort faded over time, but it never disappeared entirely the first several times, and I had to learn to act through it rather than waiting for it to vanish before making the choice. I also had to learn to tolerate the fact that some relationships simply couldn't survive the boundary. People who were primarily using me often responded to new limitations by distancing themselves entirely, no longer finding the relationship valuable once the accommodation stopped flowing as freely. That outcome, painful as it initially felt, ultimately confirmed exactly what the boundary was designed to test. If someone disappears the moment you stop being endlessly useful, they were never actually present for you in the first place. Their departure, however uncomfortable, revealed the truth of the relationship more clearly than years of ambiguous behavior ever had. I think ultimately, learning to recognize when you're being used requires developing a kind of honest attentiveness toward patterns rather than isolated incidents. Any single instance of someone asking for a favor, showing up late, or failing to reciprocate immediately can be explained away easily, and often should be, because isolated incidents happen in every relationship without indicating anything sinister. What matters is the accumulated pattern over time, the consistent correlation between someone's warmth and their need, the consistent imbalance in emotional labor, the consistent resistance to your growth, the consistent disappearance the moment you have nothing left to offer. Once you learn to see that pattern clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee it, and that clarity, however uncomfortable initially, becomes one of the most valuable forms of self-protection you can develop. You start entering new relationships with a quieter, steadier form of attention, noticing early whether someone's interest in you correlates with your usefulness or exists independently of it. You start trusting your own perception over your instinct to explain away discomfort. You start understanding that being needed and being valued are fundamentally different experiences, and that only one of them is actually worth building a life around. I don't think this recognition should make anyone cynical about connection in general. Most relationships, thankfully, aren't built primarily around extraction. Most people, most of the time, genuinely care about the people in their lives beyond what those people can provide. But learning to recognize the signs of the relationships that aren't like that protects you from spending years inside dynamics that quietly diminish you while disguising themselves as care. That protection, hard-earned through uncomfortable self-honesty, is worth every bit of the discomfort it takes to develop. There is one more sign I had to learn to recognize, and it took longer than all the others because it required looking closely at language rather than behavior. People who are using you tend to speak in absolutes when describing what you owe them, and in vague generalities when describing what they owe you. I noticed this pattern specifically during moments of conflict, when I finally worked up the courage to express that something felt unbalanced. The response was almost always the same shape, a detailed, specific recounting of everything I supposedly hadn't done enough of, paired with a vague, general assurance that of course they cared about me too, without any specific examples to support it. That asymmetry and specificity revealed something important. People tend to remember, in detail, the things that matter most to them. If someone can list, with precision, every instance where you fell short of their expectations, but can only offer generic reassurances when asked to describe what they've done for you in return, that discrepancy tells you where their actual attention has been focused. Genuine reciprocity tends to be remembered specifically because it was genuinely noticed and valued. Extraction is remembered specifically because it was tracked, consciously or not, as an ongoing account of what was owed. I also learned to notice how people who were using me responded to my own achievements, particularly achievements that had nothing to do with them. Genuine support, I discovered, tends to be uncomplicated. People who actually care about you feel simple, uncomplicated joy at your success, without needing to insert themselves into the narrative or diminish the achievement in some subtle way. People who were primarily using me responded to my successes with something more complicated, congratulations tinged with a strange undertone, a quick redirection back to their own circumstances, or occasionally a subtle reminder that my success shouldn't change how available I remain to them. That reaction, discomfort, or quiet resentment at my growth revealed an investment in keeping me exactly where I had always been rather than genuine investment in my flourishing. I think this is worth naming clearly because it's one of the more painful signs to recognize. It's easier to accept that someone doesn't care about your struggles than to accept that they might feel threatened by your success. But both reactions point toward the same underlying truth. Someone who primarily values you for what you provide has a vested interest in your stability remaining exactly as it currently is, useful, accommodating, unchanged. Genuine growth, genuine success, genuine expansion of your life beyond what currently serves them threatens that arrangement. And the discomfort some people display around your good news is often a more honest signal than anything they say directly. Learning to notice these patterns also required me to examine my own history more carefully, particularly the early experiences that had taught me to equate usefulness with worthiness in the first place. I don't think anyone arrives at adulthood already believing that being needed is the same as being loved. That belief gets built somewhere, usually through early experiences where affection felt conditional on performance, on helpfulness, on being easy and accommodating rather than simply being present as yourself. Recognizing where that belief originated didn't excuse the people who later took advantage of it, but it helped me understand why I had been such fertile ground for that particular kind of exploitation in the first place. Once I understood that history, I started deliberately practicing a different kind of self-worth, one not contingent on what I provided to anyone. This practice felt awkward at first, almost indulgent, as though simply existing without constantly proving my usefulness through accommodation was somehow selfish. Over time, that discomfort faded, replaced by something steadier, a sense of worth that didn't require constant external validation through usefulness. That internal shift changed how I approached every relationship afterward, because I no longer needed people to need me in order to feel secure in my own value. I also had to learn to distinguish between healthy interdependence and the specific kind of one-sided extraction I had spent years tolerating. Not every instance of someone needing something from you indicates exploitation. Healthy relationships involve mutual need, mutual support, moments where one person leans on the other more heavily depending on circumstance. The difference lies in whether that leaning eventually reciprocates, whether the person who receives support during your strong moments is willing to offer support during your difficult ones. Exploitation isn't defined by someone needing you, it's defined by the permanent, unchanging direction of that need, always flowing toward them, never flowing back. I think this distinction matters because it prevents the recognition of exploitation from curdling into a general suspicion of anyone who ever needs anything from you. That suspicion, taken too far, isolates you from the genuine mutual support that healthy relationships require. The goal was never to become someone who refuses to help anyone. The goal was to become someone who notices whether help flows in both directions over time, and who trusts that observation enough to act on it when the answer becomes consistently one-sided. Eventually, I developed a kind of quiet internal test that I still use whenever I'm uncertain about a relationship's actual balance. I imagine a version of myself with nothing left to offer, no favors, no money, no emotional labor, no accommodation, simply present as a person with needs of my own and nothing else. I ask myself honestly whether the specific person in question would still want me around in that scenario, would still make time for me, would still show genuine interest in who I am rather than what I provide. That imagined test, applied honestly across every relationship in my life, has become one of the clearest tools I have for distinguishing genuine connection from quiet extraction. I don't share all of this to encourage anyone to become guarded or distrustful toward everyone in their life. Most people, most of the time, aren't using you, and treating every relationship with suspicion would cost you the genuine connections that make life meaningful in the first place. I share this because recognizing these signs clearly, after years of confusing usefulness with value, gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost, the ability to trust my own perception of how I was actually being treated, rather than constantly explaining away discomfort in favor of maintaining relationships that had quietly stopped serving me long before I was willing to admit it. If there's one thing I would want anyone reading this to take with them, it's that discomfort in a relationship is information, not paranoia. If you consistently feel drained rather than nourished by someone's presence, if their warmth arrives suspiciously close to their needs and fades once those needs are met, if your own struggles receive less attention than theirs, if your growth seems to unsettle them more than it excites them, trust that discomfort. It is rarely wrong, even when it takes years to fully understand what it's been trying to tell you.